Happy Sunday, everyone. At the risk of beating a dead horse, the horse is still alive, and we still need to talk about COVID from time to time for reasons that I'll get into in a minute about having to remember and try and make sure that we can incorporate lessons learned for improving future outcomes. I was reminded recently of this article in The Atlantic in October 2022. This person, Emily Oster, saying, "Let's declare a pandemic amnesty. Focus on the future and fix the problems we still need to solve." And this made the rounds when the article came out, of course, because one of the key problems with this woman and others like her saying, "Oh, let's have an amnesty," was that it was only the voices of people who were on the wrong side, who were on the side of COVID tyranny and mandates and, supporting people losing their jobs and so forth. Only when it turned out that they were in the wrong did they say, "Oh, let's give amnesty to me and my team who had it wrong and used our positions of power and influence to force everyone to do what we thought was important and necessary." And so she only wants us to, forgive and move on because she was on the losing team. I think another issue too is that there's a total lack of accountability and remorse, right? There were no apologies. It was just like, well, we did the best we could, so let's just move on. I was reminded of this political cartoon, which I think is hilarious, showing some witches being burned allegedly in Salem. I think that's more mythical than accurate, but oops, turns out they weren't witches at all. Mistakes were made on both sides. To create all this havoc and destruction, economic, spiritual, educational, familial, societal, medical, all of this carnage across our society, and be like, oops, mistakes were made on both sides, I think is ridiculous. As we contemplate whether we ought to grant amnesty to those who were complicit in COVID-19, I'm reminded of a few things, because again, I think remembering is important before we're able to have any meaningful discussion about should amnesty exist and what lessons should we learn. Even now, only a few years later, what are the lessons that we should keep in mind moving forward? I'm going to get in a little bit later to how this complicity pertains even to our church leaders, and ought they to have a level of COVID amnesty? How should we account for the fact that they were on the wrong side of this issue? We'll get into that in just a moment. Here's this clip from Stephen Colbert highlighting what I think was like the apex of the propaganda of what people were being pushed into and how this messaging was pervading all of the institutions in our society. Take a look. I mean, this is the kind of the stuff that they want amnesty for. They want everyone to forget how everyone like Colbert and others were just useless, regurgitating talking heads, repeating the narratives of these so-called experts who were just making it up, by the way. You no doubt remember this coming straight from the White House. For the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death for yourselves, your families, and the hospitals you may soon overwhelm. Right? Oh, mistakes were made on both sides. We were accusing you of murdering grandma, but we were doing our best. Let's not forget that, separating families and hospitals, elderly care facilities, forcing people out of their jobs, masking kids, shutting down businesses, churches and the like, shutting down playgrounds and skate parks and beaches. I mean, this stuff was just absurd. And you might think that in times of heavy propaganda and lies swirling around, that we would be able to have a standard of truth to which we could look, leaders who can see around corners, who would be able to offer the warning voice against all of the lies that people were being spoon-fed and believing because they were coming from trusted authority figures across society, political, medical, and yes, even religious. You, of course, remember what I'm referring to, the statement that came out from the first presidency. Here's a KSL clip where they announced it.
Leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints released a strong statement today about the ongoing pandemic and the need for masks and vaccinations.
Now, religion specialist Karen Makita now joins us live with a message from the First Presidency here. And as we've been saying all along, a very bold and clear message coming from them.
Absolutely. We find ourselves fighting a war. That was the opening line in a strong statement from Presidents Russell M. Nelson, Dallin H. Oaks, and Henry B. Eyring, as they expressed concern for Latter-day Saints and, as they said, all of God's children. To limit exposure to these viruses, we urge the use of face masks in public meetings whenever social distancing is not possible. To provide personal protection from such severe infections, we urge individuals to be vaccinated. Available vaccines have proven to be both safe and effective. On January 19th of this year, President Nelson and his wife Wendy joined other senior church leaders in receiving their vaccinations. Then he reminded church members that many had worked, prayed, and fasted for the vaccines. As a former world-renowned heart surgeon, he said he considered them a miracle. Through its humanitarian efforts over the decades, he said the church has funded, distributed, and administered life-saving vaccines throughout the world, combating polio, diphtheria, tetanus, smallpox, and measles. President Nelson also urged those who are hesitant about the vaccines to counsel with competent medical professionals. Updating the official church handbook last December, leaders warned of baseless conspiracy theories. Seek out and share only credible, reliable, and factual sources of information. The First Presidency called COVID-19 and its variants an unrelenting pandemic. Protection, they said, can only be achieved by vaccinating a high percentage of the population.
All right, so a couple things. The first is tying that handbook statement to conspiracies about, vaccines and whatever. The handbook was updated late 2020 in December with this, among other things, to seek out and share only credible, reliable, and factual sources of information. But the context of it was far more the perception across the media and the elite that it was the Trump folks and the MAGA and the conservatives who were lying about the stolen election, that the election was rigged, that there was a lot of so-called misinformation about that. That was the narrative throughout late 2020, heading into, of course, 2021, January 6th, and all the rest. And so, sure that some element of this handbook had to do with COVID and the vaccines. Who knows? But I don't think it can be correlated precisely to COVID when there were other factors at play as well. Let's also remember, by the way, that when the handbook is urging people to seek out and share only credible, reliable, and factual sources of information, that the implication often, as the First Presidency statement said that we're about to get into, the implication is that it's the kind of political, governmental, medical voices, experts, who are the most credible and reliable and factual. When in fact, as we've seen, especially throughout COVID, but certainly before then, that these voices are often, if not very often, on the wrong side of issues, that they're perpetuating misinformation, that they are in fact the instigators and sources of mis and disinformation. And so even for there to be an implication that, we should seek out and share only credible, reliable, and factual sources of information from these so-called experts is bogus. It's often the citizen journalists, the skeptics, the true scientists who are challenging authority, challenging established narratives, speaking truth to established power. These are the voices that often turn out to be proven correct, which is why the conspiracy theorists, so-called, of recent years have been, on the whole, the factual, credible, and reliable sources of information, the people who are on the right side of the issue. I also want to take issue with this idea, as we heard in that KSL clip, that we're supposedly told by our leaders that protection from COVID can only be achieved by vaccinating a high percentage of the population. Let's just pause there. How does that quote sit with you? To have the church telling its members that protection from a pandemic can only, that was the word we heard in the KSL clip, can only be achieved by vaccinating a high percentage of the population. I'll let you interpret that the way that you want. To completely leave God and the priesthood and miracles and relying on him for protection and salvation and all the rest, prayer and everything, all natural sources of healing, other forms of, you get ivermectin and other stuff, other things, plants and herbs that God has provided, sunlight, exercise, nutrition. Give me a break. To say that the sorcery coming from big pharma, the pharmacopoeia, that is the only means of salvation, literally is the definition of relying on the arm of flesh. That the scriptures counsel us again and again and again and again against. To not rely on, to not trust on, to not lean on the arm of flesh. And yet, protection can only be achieved by big pharma's products. Now, the claim that this vaccine is, or was even at the time, proven to be safe and effective, I think is extremely problematic. Again, the quote, available vaccines have proven to be both safe and effective. Keep in mind, this was August 12th, 2021. These rushed vaccines being exempted from all the typical testing and process, to the extent there is hardly any testing, frankly, for these vaccines, because the manufacturers get immunity and don't have to go through, enough rigorous testing and transparency for their products to be foisted and forced on the rest of us. But the claim that these were safe and effective is not borne out by the evidence. There are numerous examples. Here's one. This was from a study of kids in England, late 2021, right around the same time that this statement came out from the first presidency. And they're looking at the data. What do we see at the bottom? This is talking about myocarditis and pericarditis, these kind of heart conditions of inflammation leading to death. Among both adolescents and children, myocarditis and pericarditis were documented only in the vaccinated groups. That's the COVID vax, by the way, with rates of 27 and 10 cases per million after first and second doses, respectively. In other words, this huge rise in myocarditis. You've got athletes in their prime falling over, keeling over, dead. You've got people doing autopsies. What do they call it? The morticians doing autopsies on people and pulling out these long, stringy, nasty things out of their veins from, one can only presume. And people are, all these morticians and people involved in that are alleging that the clear correlation is the COVID vaccine. But again and again, you see post-vaccine, these people getting it are higher risks. Here's this other one. The conclusion being that there's 7 times higher risk of pericarditis from getting the COVID vax, 6.1 times for myocarditis, 3.8 times more likely to get encephalomyelitis, however you pronounce that, 3 times as likely to get blood clots. And the pushback would be, oh, but these are so tiny and insignificant. The vast majority of people who, okay, even if I concede that to double or triple or quadruple or sextuple, right, the rates of harm and death from these things should be significantly alarming. If it's your family, if it's your child who is a condition of going to school, or if it's you as a condition of keeping your job that had to get one of these things that you had reservations about, right? But you were urged to do so by your religious leaders who you consider prophets, seers, and apostles seeing around corners. You were urged to do so by your religious leaders. You were counseled to seek out expert voices. You go talk to your doctor. Your doctor doesn't know anything. He just knows what he's repeating, the propaganda talking points from the manufacturers of the vaccines themselves and the national institutes that have been completely co-opted and are not at all authoritative voices on these matters. They're totally political. And so you go listen to all these people and they're like, get it, it's safe, it's effective. And you get it, and your kid or yourself, you end up with myocarditis, you're dying, your kid dies, whatever. Are you going to be comforted like, oh, the vast majority of people are still okay? It's not this like massive, culling of the human population. No, it's not reassuring to you that the majority of people are okay if your child is among the ones, or you yourself end up kick in the bucket because you decided to listen to these voices and be pressured. So no, the data I think is clear. Now you could quibble and say, well, safety is in the eye of the beholder. How do you actually define safety? Because even if the rate of myocarditis sextuples, because of the COVID vax, on the whole, that's still safe because 90 whatever percentage of people are still okay. Like, you could get into arbitrary, vague definitions of what it means to be safe. But relative to other vaccines and relative to the people who did not receive the product, like in that first study of kids not getting it, it was safer to not get the vaccine. Okay, so I think we can establish that. I don't think we can conclusively say, unless you were being very generous and very manipulative with what it means to be safe, that these jabs were in fact safe. Now, let's get into the claim of effectiveness. I love this video. It speaks for itself. For those of you watching the audio version of this is a 2-minute long clip, most of which you're just going to hear music because you're not going to see the visuals, which are all the headlines of the changing claims of effective rates of the vaccine. So if you're on audio version, you can go ahead and skip or a couple minutes until I'm talking again. Let's roll the clip.
So now we have 2 vaccines that are really quite effective, highly effective, virtually 100% efficacious. Shot. We've got to make sure we clarify that with people. It has nothing to do whether or not it's effective. We know it's highly effective. Highly effective.
So, not effective. They're not safe. They're not effective. I remember this clip I found from Congressman Massey. They were doing this oversight hearing, talking to physicians working in the government who were seeking more time to study the side effects of these vaccines and ensure their safety, but were fired instead for simply challenging asking questions and wanting to do more due diligence to determine if these things were actually safe. Here's the clip.
So Dr. Gruber testified that further testing was required in order to approve the vaccine for children. Yet Dr. Marks and the FDA promoted EUA vaccine for use on children without properly testing it for safety and efficacy. The Biden administration was mandating the vaccine on the military and young people going to school, despite a lack of testing and data, despite growing reports of vaccine injuries. This kind of decision-making by the administrative state is concerning. The FDA should not have approved the vaccine for children, EUA or otherwise, without proper testing. Injury from COVID vaccination is real. The New York Times recently profiled several people who, in the prime of their lives, suffered from vaccine injury. Had the risks been known or shared, many of these injuries could have been prevented. Dr. Woodcock says she is disappointed in herself for this, as she should be. It's our job in Congress to oversee government agencies. When agents of the administrative state are not doing their job, they must be held accountable. This hearing will give us an opportunity to discuss this with an eye toward legislative reform. Think about this. Right when they were getting the warnings that myocarditis and pericarditis were real and serious side effects to the vaccine, And they had already agreed, the top scientists at FDA had already agreed to compress the schedule as much as possible. Right when they got the message that there were serious side effects, and Peter Marks, instead of telling them, we're going to give you more time to study this, he told them to compress the schedule even more. And when they said that compressing the schedule was not possible, he fired them. He took them off the job, assigned them to other duties. The top vaccine officials who've been there for 30 years, taken off the job because they wanted more time to study the effects of the vaccines, and they were told that they needed to do this quickly because they needed to be mandated.
Okay, so when we're talking about amnesty, mistakes were made on both sides. This is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. We're talking about that there was this massive psychosis induced by the entire establishment, foisted not only on the American people, but people across the world, and that the voices that you would otherwise rely on to be challenging those in power, I'm talking about journalists, I'm also talking about, prophets, seeing around corners, so-called, as Sherry Dew likes to say, right? The voices that we would turn to were, in fact, complicit and not speaking truth to power, not representing the people and holding power to account. It was on the side of power, foisting that on the rest of us, right? We were the ones being pushed into, as you saw in that KSL clip of leaders of the church, putting their photos on social media. Here I am being a responsible, good global citizen and doing it, so you all should too. And now in my capacity as the, prophet of God, I'm urging everyone to do the same. Not only, by the way, for the jab, but also, remember they said urging the use of face masks, right? And social distancing, both of these things completely bogus. Social distancing was totally made up. They picked an arbitrary number. Then you have stickers on the grocery store floors and, businesses putting decals up to shame you and encourage, like, total lie, total fabrication. Face masks, not at all effective, not at all necessary. And, and we are in this mind war where the voices that you would otherwise turn to for trust and guidance were complicit in the problem itself. So let's get into a final few things as it pertains to church leaders. I appreciated this clip from Elder Bednar. This was in the midst of it, June 2020. This was, fresh, new, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. We were just getting out of that. Everyone's still losing their minds, not knowing what's going on. So it's June 2020. BYU's law school did a religious freedom annual review. Of course, online, because they shut everything down, and the church wanted to be compliant, so the churches are shut down, and BYU's event is all online. So Elder Bednar sitting in his office giving this brief sharing an address. Here's a brief clip from it.
COVID-19 has alerted us to the importance of defending the borders between personal liberty, constitutional rights, and governmental authority. COVID-19 has alerted us to many attacks on the freedoms of religion, speech, and assembly. And the list goes on.
So I can appreciate here that he's recognizing, at least to some degree, that this, even in June, just months into this, was a massive encroachment on religious freedom, the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. I'm glad that he pointed these things out, even in a religious freedom event, because as I've criticized in the past, religious freedom is a subset. Religious liberty is a subset of the right to private property and the right to assembly, the right to free speech. If you have the right to own a building and to assemble in it with people that you want and to speak your mind and share your values, then you have religious liberty. But to fight for only religious liberty to the exclusion of the encroachment against general free speech and general property rights and freedom of assembly, you're not going to end up with religious freedom, and you're giving a big middle finger to everyone else who values those freedoms for non-religious purposes. So I appreciate here that Elder Bednar is not just talking about religious freedom, but he's saying this was an encroachment across all these things. Now, his recognition of that tyranny, I think, was, comported with his personality, very, very soft. I'll call it even milquetoast a little bit. But at least we had a voice in church leadership. Now, he's a minority. I don't really see this echoed from other people. In fact, 2 years later, Elder Oaks is at the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Summit in Rome, and he defends the government. You know, this former Supreme Court justice in Utah, he's defending the government. He says that the government must sometimes limit the rights of some to act upon their religious beliefs when doing so is necessary to protect the health, safety, and welfare of all. He's defending the government when doing so is necessary. Well, when is it actually necessary? It's necessary when those in charge claim it's necessary, when the experts that are counseling those in government just make it up and are often completely wrong. There's no recognition in this talk that I saw that Elder Oaks gave about needing to stand up for these liberties, needing to hold our ground, recognizing the government is corrupt and often wrong. And when it claims these things are necessary for public health, public safety, public welfare, these are broad exceptions to which you can drive a truck. Guys, I work in politics. I can't tell you how many times I hear bureaucrats defend some oppressive, dumb, big, stupid, pro-government law on the basis of public safety or public health or public welfare. These catch-all terms through which you can do all kinds of stuff, because how do you actually quantify and define that in any meaningful way? This is why standing up for liberty is so important, because that is an individual principle. It is a power, it is action, it is your right to act and to do as you please, as long as you're not harming others. But for some other unelected bureaucrat or elected politician to say, public health requires that we do X, Y, and Z, they're taking away your freedom, and they're doing it often on the pretext of things that they're completely wrong about. So Elder Oaks defending the government, saying sometimes they have to limit the rights to act upon their religious beliefs. Like, that's crazy. This, by the way, was cited in the Supreme Court case when the feds were fighting Brigham and Utah and everyone over polygamy. And they passed the Moral Edmonds Act and the Tucker and all these different federal acts. And the Mormons were saying, oh, but this is our religious, freedom, and we're acting on our religious belief. And the federal government came after them and said, nope, you're not allowed to do that, because sometimes the government has an interest in denying people from acting on their religious beliefs. One of the justices in the opinion even said something to the effect of, if someone's religious belief involved child sacrifice or human sacrifice or whatever, clearly we, the government, we, the people, would not tolerate acting on that religious belief. Of course, the distinction is you're actually aggressing on others through that action. You're actually harming them. In this case, it's theoretical harm. It's this invisible virus that you may or may, like, you could, on the guise and pretext of public safety, shut down society at any time, because there are often and always contagious diseases around. The public schools are petri dishes for this stuff, right? We ought to shut them down. It leads to this quote from Elder Renlund talking about the face mask. Take a look.
As it relates to this pandemic, especially in temples, that means social distancing, wearing a mask, and not gathering in large groups. These steps demonstrate our love for others and provide us a measure of protection. Wearing a face covering is a sign of Christ-like love for our brothers and sisters.
Right, because if spreading a disease of any kind, if having a communicable, you sneeze, you cough, you breathe, you talk, and that can infect someone else. Therefore, containing all your germs is an act of Christ-like love. Well, but that doesn't apply just to COVID. There was no exception there. If you've got the flu, you got the cold, you're on an airplane, someone coughs, like the application of this purported principle from Elder Renlund is that you must always be wearing a face mask, because you are always spreading around different bacteria and viri to different people. The viruses, I think, right? So, we got the First Presidency urging this stuff, claiming it's safe and effective when it's not. They're urging you to follow the, quote, wise and thoughtful recommendations of medical experts and government leaders. Now, knowing what we know, I think the implication of this statement was that what you're hearing from medical experts and government leaders is wise and thoughtful. But they worded it, the attorneys at Curtin McConkie and the communications department and they worded it in such a way as to leave a little loophole there where you might actually say, maybe the First Presidency meant that we only need to follow the medical experts and government leaders to the extent that their recommendations are wise and thoughtful. They're not saying to follow all of their recommendations, They're saying to follow the wise and thoughtful recommendations. So maybe there's some wiggle room there to say, are they like sending a code where they're trying to look good to Babylon, to Caesar, and like, hey, we're recommending this to our citizens, while leaving the little like wink, wink, loophole for you to be able to be like, no, all those medical experts and government leaders, their recommendations are not wise, not thoughtful, so I don't need to listen to them. There's an argument there to be made. I'm skeptical of that argument based on what I know and have seen, but that's just one dude's musing, so you do you. Okay, so to me, there was a big missed opportunity to stand up for, sure, religious liberty, but more fundamentally, the right of association, the right to private property, the right to free speech. There was an opportunity. Many people were seeing around the corners. They don't have the official title of prophet, but they were reading the data. They were seeing things for what it was. They were contextualizing the information and not buying into the hysteria and the fear and the propaganda. They were a warning voice. They were shut down. They were censored. They were canceled. They were fired, right? All these things. I mean, even this video years later, probably going to get, penalized on YouTube for all I know, because of the things that I'm saying. You had this massive apparatus of censorship and shadow banning and silence coming against people who were on the right side, whether because they guessed well or they were reading the early data and they were, again, contextualizing things without all the hysteria. I want to end with this, because as we think about COVID amnesty, as we think about how do we deal with the media and the politicians and the so-called medical experts, the science community, the Anthony Fauci's of the world, but then also our own church leaders who were carrying water for the establishment and foisting their recommendations upon us and lacing them with this religious, implication that now God's leaders have said this, so you ought to do it too. As we think about all that and we consider what is amnesty, if it should be had or given, what does it look like? I think it's important to remember in the Book of Mormon, one of the most common words used is the word remember. Again and again and again, fathers to their sons, prophets to their people are saying, remember the things that the Lord has done. Remember this. Remember how God did this for us. Remember these things. Remember the greatness of God. Remember our sinfulness. It is like one of the most frequent and common commandments in the Book of Mormon. I think that applies to us today. We ought not forget. We ought not to just move on and let this stuff slip. We ought not forget how we acted, how susceptible we were to fear and propaganda. We ought to remember what these institutions, these corrupt institutions in many cases, did. We ought to remember the massive failure, the mass psychosis, the degree to which everyone went along with this agenda, the failure to stand up to it. We ought to remember these things. Why? You know the quote, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. I like to have a little twist there and say, those who don't learn from the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat them. We have to remember. You look at even, I've shared this before, but the knowledge literacy rates of American history from kids in public schools across the country is like 13% proficiency. And so when you have an electorate that grew up being taught civics and American history in ways that were not interesting or relevant to them, so they don't pay attention, they don't remember, then they're never going to apply the lessons of the past. They're never going to extract the principles and the values. And, so that's why we ended up doing our own Tuttle Twins books, to try and draw those lessons from the past and say, this is how they apply today. Remember these things that happened in the past, and then apply that knowledge, apply those principles to today. The Book of Mormon counsels us the same. Remember again and again. I think we can forgive. So there probably is some role of amnesty. Now, I think that differs at differing levels of complicity. The people who were just steamrolled and, it's like in Germany, right? The lay German citizen who was just swept up in all the propaganda versus, the Nazi officials who knew what they were doing. There's clearly levels here where you got Fauci and his ilk on one end, and then you've got the average American that's just conditioned into fear on the other end because they're glued to MSNBC. So I think there's different levels, but I think for forgiveness, there has to be a measure of being held accountable. Right? If there's no accountability, then these people have no remorse. They're going to do it again the moment they step into power, and we're going to go through the same mistakes. So there's where I get a little more cautious with my forgiveness. I'm like, is there any humility? Is there any recognition? Is there any accountability? Or is it like that cartoon? Oh, mistakes were made. We were doing the best that we could. Or you get people who are still defending what they said and did, during COVID and doubling down on those positions, even though they're totally wrong. So I think we can forgive, but I think we must not forget. I think we cannot forget what we did, what they did, what happened. Because if you're putting your tinfoil hat on like me and you're looking at the people in charge, like the elite in our society across different sectors and industries, I think there's a clear recognition that this was experimental in a lot of ways to see how much people could be conditioned into further surrendering their freedoms, further consolidating power in the government, further inflating the economy to the benefit of the few who get access to those newly printed dollars from the Fed. Over and over, there's this, oh, okay, interesting. Like, so maybe next time it's not a pandemic, maybe it's a cyber attack, maybe it's, hyperinflation and economic collapse. Who knows what the next event is? But if we don't remember, right, then we're going to forget and we're going to get sucked into it again. We are in, I think, a mind war. We would never want to send our children to some far-flung physical battlefield if they didn't have a weapon and body armor and knowledge of the enemy, motivations of the enemy, where the enemy might attack, how the enemy will attack, the rules of engagement. You would be beside yourself if your child was placed into a combat zone without those basic necessities to be able to hopefully survive, if not succeed. And yet, I think so many of us place our children and ourselves into spiritual and ideological battlefields without weaponry, without body armor and a shield, without knowledge of the enemy's motivations, how the enemy is going to attack, what the rules of engagement are. We're just wandering around the battlefield and thus becoming casualties. We have to remember. We have to remember how it happened before, past mind wars that we've been through, so that we can be better prepared for the future. See you next Sunday.